Again, I'm Scott Winter. I've been with Colorado Springs Utilities for about 17 years, but I have a lot of years of experience in horticulture prior to my time here, including my time here as well. So we're going to jump right in to the presentation. Yeah, essentially, I've got a degree in horticulture from Kansas State, so I'm a Midwesterner from Kansas, with a lot of years of experience in horticulture and in water planning as well now at Colorado Springs Utilities. But I think this subject is perhaps one of the most popular of all subjects that we teach here through Colorado Springs Utilities. Just about everyone wants a low maintenance landscape. They generally also want it to require next to no water and be really inexpensive to create. So balancing all three of those things can be extremely challenging. We're going to focus on the low maintenance aspects of that, but there will be design concepts talked about, as well as some misconceptions, and we'll talk about what we mean by a water-wise landscape as well a little bit. We'll first just define what a water-wise landscape is in our definition at Colorado Springs Utilities. It is not a landscape that is just rock and with very few plants, that is maybe not requiring any water. In our climate, having a successful landscape that's attractive, that adds value, that provides something useful and durable and attractive does require some supplemental irrigation. Typically that could be done with an irrigation system or by hand, but it's really not something that you can achieve without some water. So what we're talking about with water-wise is some additional water is definitely necessary, but we want it to be practical, useful, durable, attractive. We want it to be something that really does enrich your life, improve your life, give you a lot of satisfaction. So we can achieve that with very little water and with relatively low maintenance as well. So we'll focus on that. So this is my front yard here. It's a buffalo grass lawn that looks very similar to what you would typically see in most lawns around town with Kentucky bluegrass. But buffalo grass uses about a third of the water, and this is the kind of thing we'll be talking more about. So what is low maintenance? Really, maintenance is dependent. So it's dependent on the situation, it's dependent on how the landscape is used, it's depending on the plants, but not, plants aren't always going to be low maintenance. So a shrub that we would typically think of as being low maintenance is only low maintenance if it's put in the right location. So if you plant a spreading shrub that may never need pruning otherwise, if you put that right next to a sidewalk, for example, where you have to keep trimming it back, then that's no longer low maintenance. So even low maintenance plants can become high maintenance if they're put in the wrong locations. So and then the inputs that we provide, so the maintenance we do provide, it needs to be done in a timely manner, ideally, the right time of year, in the right, in the right sequence, with other things we do in the landscape. And so maintenance is dependent. You're not going to find something that is always low maintenance. It depends on the other things happening in the site. So it's not just about how much maintenance. I think it's important for us all to think about what kinds of maintenance we're willing to do. Some people like mowing. That's the kind of maintenance they're willing to do. Other people don't want to mow, and they're willing to maybe do weeding instead of mowing. Some people hate weeding. So it depends on what kind of maintenance you really want to be doing. It's not just about how much. It's also about when you want to be doing the maintenance. In my personal landscape, most of the maintenance I do is right at the beginning of the season. So I have a lot of plants I have to cut back from the previous year's growth. But then after that, it's a really big 1 or 2 day push at the beginning of the season. After that, it's just some weed control, and I don't do much else. And so for me, I'm willing to do those 2 days at the beginning of the season as long as that means I don't have to be doing a whole bunch of maintenance week in and week out. You know, it's important to consider what your skills and knowledge are. If you don't want to take a lot of classes and learn more and more about different kinds of maintenance, you know, you need to understand that, so that whatever skills you have or knowledge you have, you know, the kind of maintenance you need to do is what fits that. And then certain kinds of maintenance are going to require, you know, tools or equipment like lawnmowers or hedge shears, weed whips, things like that. Are you willing to invest in those? Do you already have those things? Making sure that whatever you do, you're willing to invest in the tools or equipment necessary to take care of that. So watering, obviously, as Colorado Springs Utilities, this is our primary concern, is how our customers are using water and how we can help them manage that. It's incredibly important in our climate. Again, drought is very common here. And we do have a water supply that can be variable, and sometimes we can be in shortages, which require us to implement watering restrictions. And so your landscape needs to be able to tolerate those things. Maybe you want to use as little water as possible, and you know, because you've got to drag a hose around, you don't want to spend a lot of time on that. If you have an irrigation system, irrigation systems can be a lot of maintenance at times, and particularly if it's an older system, it might be leaky as well. That's certainly a consideration. I actually prefer having an irrigation system because it does reduce the maintenance from day to day. I'm willing to do that extra work at the beginning of the season to get the irrigation system in shape, but I don't really want to drag a hose around, so an irrigation system really is ideal for me. So pruning and shearing, like I said at the beginning, I do a lot of that kind of maintenance at the beginning of the season. I have to shear back a lot of native grasses and ornamental grasses, perennials, things like that. I typically leave those up all winter for winter interest. Helps feed the birds and things like that. And so I don't do anything really in the fall or the winter at all, and I just come in and clean everything up and shear that back in the spring. Of course, that can be a little bit challenging because you've got to have some place to put that material, and so that kind of thing is important to understand. If you've going to be generating a lot of material out of your yard, you've got to have some place to take that and the ability to take it. All right, mowing, again, that's something that is very dependent on the person. I know folks that definitely do not like to mow week in and week out, and so that's something to really consider. Other folks really like it. So we're going to talk about some misconceptions. I think one of the main misconceptions around low maintenance landscapes in our area is the idea that rocks over fabric is the best low maintenance option. And you may even have landscapers that push that option for you, but what I've found and what a lot of people find is that it's really not low maintenance. It may reduce your maintenance for the first couple of years because you put down the fabric and the rock, and that will inhibit weeds for a short period of time, but ultimately the weeds will find a way to come up through the rocks. Soil will settle on the fabric. It becomes a real nice environment for weeds to grow, and then it can become a really big challenge to manage over time. And ultimately, very often that fabric will come to the surface. It will become so full of weeds that it's really difficult to manage. And plants don't like fabric. The ornamental landscape plants that you're going to want to plant, they typically don't like fabric at all. Very often their roots will grow right at the surface of the soil, making them far less drought tolerant, more susceptible to heat and cold conditions potentially. And it can be a really big problem for trees as well. So if you put down fabric and rock around mature trees and you're not watering those trees anymore, it's very likely those trees will die. Maybe not right away, but ultimately that's likely the fate they'll face. So I think it's important to really consider that before you make that decision. And then if it's something you want to get rid of, that can be extremely challenging. So this river rock in the picture, this is probably going to require equipment to remove, unless you want to spend months doing it. And that's a huge challenge that most people would have to hire out, and that may not be something you want to do. Another misconception is that low maintenance landscapes or low water landscapes even may require fewer plants. And that's not necessarily the case. You can certainly have a very dense, densely planted landscape that is low maintenance if you've got the right plants in the right place. And so you don't really need to sacrifice the density or the variety even to achieve a low maintenance landscape. And very often you do want more plants because you really want to cover the ground and compete with weeds. And so that's a misconception you see a lot, where you see landscapes with very large open spaces, very few plants, and that may not require a lot of maintenance initially, but over time, again, if you're not competing with the weeds in some way, that will increase your maintenance. So another one that we see a lot is that a low maintenance landscape really can mean no maintenance. And I think that's a misconception that folks have, that if you have a home, you can achieve something where very little maintenance occurs other than what's happening inside the house, maybe occasionally painting the house. If you purchased a home and you live in a home, there is going to be some maintenance in the landscape. There's just no way to avoid it. And so the idea here is really to minimize the maintenance and build something that means you're going to be doing the kinds of maintenance you're willing to do and physically capable of doing. So the idea of no maintenance is really not real. So what are the keys to success to achieve a low maintenance landscape? So you need to know your needs and your limitations, and you plan for those. So if you have physical limitations, you certainly need to plan for those. If you've got monetary limitations, you need to plan for those, and there are ways to do things that are really affordable, especially if you're patient. And so you want to know those limitations and you plan for those. Really, you want to get complete control of weeds before you start something new. I think this is, a step that a lot of folks miss, where they've maybe inherited a landscape, they bought a new home, and it's in poor condition with a lot of weeds. And you want to get a quick fix, and sometimes shortcutting weed control can just perpetuate that problem. And so getting complete control of any sort of major weed infestation or problem is really important before you put in new plants or make a big change. So you want to also water only where and to the extent necessary. For example, if you've got an area where you've just got shrubs planted in an area, and those shrubs are going to spread over time and fill up that space, you may not want to irrigate that with spray irrigation that's going to spray every inch of that landscape. If you've got a lot of open space there and you're irrigating it, that's just going to encourage the weeds. So that's a situation where drip irrigation is probably a much better option. Drip irrigation puts the water right at the plant's roots where it's needed, and you're not putting water and broadcasting that across the whole landscape where it's not needed, where it can really only encourage weeds. So that's really important. You want to be consistent with your maintenance. If you get behind on the weed control or some other issue, it can be hard to catch up, and so being consistent is important. You may find yourself in a situation where you have to hire someone to help you get caught up if you get too far behind or that kind of thing. So being consistent is important. Carving out the time, if it's once a month or once a week, or that one big push in the spring, you want to make sure you're consistent about that and that you're keeping up with the maintenance. Covering the ground, as I mentioned before, so that you can compete with weeds, is extremely important. And that doesn't just mean with plants. As we'll talk about a little bit later, wood mulch or an organic mulch is a far better option for buying you time, covering the ground, competing with weeds than rock mulch is. It does require some maintenance to keep that wood mulch deep enough to compete with the weeds, but it's very effective at doing so, particularly if you're in a situation where you need to buy some time before you can get a lot of plants put in, or even figure out what you want to do. And so we'll talk a little bit more about covering the ground, but if you can't compete with the weeds, then the weeds will eat your lunch, basically. So again, covering the ground, we'll talk a little bit more about that because it's such an important issue. So bare ground and unplanted rock are really the enemy here. Those are going to be just havens for weeds and a challenge to deal with, year in and year out. So you want desirable vegetation to cover as much of the ground as possible. That may mean that you will plant native grass. So this situation here, this is my backyard. It's a relatively steep slope, and so the best option for me in this situation to cover a lot of the ground at a relatively low cost was native grass. So I seeded this mix of native grasses in here, so they're all native, relatively low water. I water typically maybe once every 3 weeks or so, depending on the conditions, so not a lot. And I mow it probably twice a year, so it doesn't require a lot of maintenance. Fortunately, the mowing I keep to a minimum because it is a slope. It is a little bit challenging to mow, but this could be a great option for folks because it's relatively affordable, because you're just planting seed, and because it doesn't require a lot of water or a lot of maintenance. And I do get a handful of weeds in here, mostly dandelions, but not a lot. So it works quite well. And so this is a good option for a lot of folks. If you do want to use unplanted rock, the over fabric, to cover some of the ground, and I have situations along the side of my house where I do this because I park there, and I want to have an area where I can put some tools and wheelbarrows and things like that where I don't really need a lot of plants. I use small rock in that situation. So the river rock that we saw a couple slides back, that can be really challenging to clean because it's bulky, and leaves and pine needles and trash and all kinds of things get down in those in between the rocks, and it's challenging to deal with. If you use a relatively small rock, so 1 inch or less in diameter, then it's easy to rake and clean up and clean and keep looking tidy. So if you're going to use rock, use a small aggregate. And really, like I said, organic mulch, wood-based mulch, at least 3 or 4 inches thick is really good at competing with weeds. You don't want to put fabric under that at all. If you get the mulch at least 3 inches thick, it will compete with weeds quite well. And so that's a great option if you don't know yet what you want to plant, or if you're getting a plan together and you need to just buy time because you can't afford to buy everything at once. It's a great way to go. So low maintenance plants, as I mentioned before, there are plants that are definitely low maintenance, but you've got to put them in the right situation to be low maintenance. Meaning you don't want to put them in a place where you're going to have to continually shear them or prune them to keep them off of the driveway or the sidewalk, or you don't want to plant things too close to the house. But there are plants that are far less maintenance than other things. So you want to prioritize those things. You want to think about the longevity of those plants too. So some plants don't live very long. Perennials, there are certain perennials in particular. Annuals, obviously, you got to plant every year. So you want to think about how long these plants might live. You want to get if you want low maintenance, you really want plants that are going to live a very long time. That tends to be shrubs, grasses, and trees. The more you get into perennials, the more you're going to find things that don't live very long, that will need to be replaced. Fast-growing species, like fast-growing shrubs, fast-growing trees, those tend to be maintenance nightmares. Most people want things that are fast-growing because it seems like, you know, that's going to fill out faster or just give me shade faster, that kind of thing. But those trees in particular that are fast-growing are very often quite messy, relatively weak-wooded, and can be a real maintenance challenge. So just consider that before you choose something that's just fast-growing because you want something to fill out quickly. And you want to keep things relatively simple. So this picture here looks like, for the most part, you've got about 3 species of plants covering the ground here, and they're planted in masses. And so keeping things simple, planting in masses, that's a really good way to kind of keep the maintenance relatively simple and to a minimum. And so in this situation, you know, the Russian sage you might cut back in the spring. The spireas in front of them, you might shear those in the spring. The shrub on the left there, that's a Grollo sumac. You really don't need to do anything with that at all, as long as it's planted in the right location. So, you know, this is a simple palette of plants, covers most of the ground. They're using wood mulch as well, and so you don't really see any weeds, and this is a really good example of something that's relatively simple and low maintenance. So trees, as I mentioned, you want things that are a little slower growing, more drought tolerant. I'm a big fan of oaks for this. Now, understand that they are slow growing, so there are some trade-offs there, but they are very well adapted generally to our climate, and will provide a really resilient, low-maintenance option in our landscapes. So again, the fast-growing trees tend to be soft-wooded and messy. Of course, all trees, including evergreens, are going to drop leaves or needles, and so you want to, regardless of what kind of tree you have, there will be some maintenance associated with dealing with the leaves and needles. Typically, that's just once a year. You can plan for that and just plan to have a way of raking those up or composting those or whatever you need to do. But you need to plan for it. If you've got Siberian elm or willows or cottonwoods or Russian olive, those are extremely messy trees. They're also very weedy, so they produce a lot of seedlings that you have to deal with at some point. And so if you've got those and you really want low maintenance, it's really worth considering eliminating those and moving to something that's going to be lower maintenance and generally just better for our environment and not so weedy. Shrubs, you want things that are going to be spreading and really don't require pruning or shearing. So this is Pawnee Butte sand cherry. This is a native plant. It's a low-growing, spreading shrub that's really good for a variety of situations. Has red fall colors, you can see. It's nice and bright green in the summer with white flowers in the spring. An excellent plant for our area, and it has a lot of those attributes we want. So it's doesn't really require any shearing at all, as long as it's not too close to the sidewalk or driveway. It does spread. It will cover pretty good amounts of ground. It's fairly competitive with weeds, and so it's got a lot of those kinds of attributes we want to see. You really want to try to avoid things that will seed themselves a lot. And so that's a question. If you go to a garden center, you might want to ask about that particular attribute. Certain things will produce a lot of seedlings that could be a real maintenance nightmare. Perennials and ornamental grasses, you really want something that only needs to be touched one time a year. Ornamental grasses are great because you really just cut them back in the spring or late winter, and that's really all you have to do for the year. There are certain perennials that are the same way, where you just cut them back, like things like hyssop. In the background here, this pink flowered plant toward the back, that's red valerian. Those kinds of things do just need to be cut back once a year. There are some salvias and things like that. Right in front of the pink flowering plant is a plant with purple flowers that are sort of fading out in this picture, but that's a plant that can get a little leggy and not so attractive after it blooms, and that might require more than one pruning a year. So that's something to consider. It also sometimes seeds itself. So there are certain perennials that can be higher maintenance and challenging to deal with. So you really want to look for things that can just be cut back in the spring, and that's it. The situation we see here in this landscape, you've got some Kentucky bluegrass up close to this person's patio. They've chosen to have Kentucky bluegrass because they like it for recreation. It keeps the patio cooler, but it's higher maintenance than the grasses behind it. And they didn't want to cover this entire area with Kentucky bluegrass because of the amount of water it requires, because of the amount of maintenance it requires. And so they sort of split the difference here, and they planted this Blue Grama Buffalo mix, which is a native grass mix, on the back half of the backyard. And so this is an option to kind of give you the best of both worlds, where you're not reducing the maintenance entirely because you have needs for that Kentucky bluegrass, but you don't need it over the entire area, and you can choose to cut that back but still cover just about all of the ground in the yard while reducing your maintenance and your water use. So again, trees, shrubs, perennials, all of these things can fit into a low maintenance landscape. You just want to think about the frequency, and anytime you're looking for plants at a garden center, don't be tempted too much by the pretty flowers. You really want to understand these attributes. Are they going to cover the ground? Are they going to live a long time? Are they going to require more than one significant maintenance intervention each year? Those kinds of things, you really want to think those through and not get too tempted by the pretty flowers. Those other attributes are really important as well. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some potential projects you might want to try. But masses of grasses is one type of option for covering the ground that I really like. It works extremely well for both covering the ground and for creating something that's really striking and attractive, at least when the grasses are kind of at their peak. This particular grass here is ruby muley grass, which is relatively new on the market. It's not as widely found as something like a Karl Forester grass, which is another good option for covering the ground. And with a mass of grasses, it can be really striking, really modern, really low maintenance, really low water. It's a great option for using drip irrigation as well, and so you don't have to broadcast water over the entire surface. You can put it right at the root system with the drip system, and so it's a really good option for our landscapes, as long as you're choosing the right grass. So ruby muley, switchgrass, blonde ambition, blue grama, Karl Forester are some of the best options for our particular area for this. Depending on the species, you can water it once or twice a week, and then you really just cut it back once a year. You might fertilize once a year, and then you just have to control some broadleaf weeds. But if you plant it densely, like in this picture, you won't have very much of that to do. So again, drip irrigation is really the way to go with this option. This is inline drip, meaning that these tubes, these brown tubes, actually have drip emitters inside the tubing. This is actually, as long as you've designed it well and laid it out well, this is actually a lower maintenance option than having individual emitters that you have to plug into a black pipe, because those things very often pop off or they move around. And so as long as you lay this out well, it's a really low maintenance option for irrigation. And then you want to make sure you're watering properly with these. I do see sometimes that folks water way too much with their drip system in certain circumstances. So maybe watering every day for 30 minutes or more. Typically, especially with a mass of native grasses or ornamental grasses, you really only want to do it 1 or 2 times a week, maybe for an hour instead. So that'll save you some water. This is switchgrass. This is down by Colorado College. So it gives you kind of that prairie look. And it's important to remember, you may have a home in the foothills here in town, but for the most part, our city is really on the plains. So it is naturally a grassland that Colorado Springs is mostly built on. And so these grasses tend to be well adapted, especially, switchgrass is a native grass here that you can find out on the prairie anywhere you go along the Front Range. And so these are really well adapted and great for our environment. Buffalo grass, another one, excellent for a lawn. This one's called Sun Dancer. So this variety of buffalo grass is the greenest of any of the varieties, and looks the most like a traditional Kentucky bluegrass lawn. It doesn't tolerate the traffic that a Kentucky bluegrass lawn would tolerate, but has a lot of the same attributes in terms of the color in the summer, with a fraction of the water. So about 1/3 as much water is required with this particular plant. It's also native. It really likes a clay soil, a little heavier soil. If you've got really sandy soil, this is probably not the best option for you, but excellent as an alternative to a traditional lawn. You will want to seed it typically. I do have overhead spray irrigation with it, so I did till the soil and prepare the soil in a very similar way I would to a Kentucky bluegrass lawn. Then seeded it. Got a little help from my daughter to rake it in. Can't believe she was ever that small. I did cover this, and so this is the best way, covering this with this erosion blanket is really the best way to get really good germination out of it. And also, if we get a real deluge of a rainstorm in the summer, it won't wash all of your seed away. So this is the end result. Works really well. Spreading shrubs. This is an example we use a lot in a lot of our presentations. This is Grollo sumac. And you can see this really covers the majority of the landscape that isn't lawn. It's starting to spread just over the curb in this situation, and may require some pruning there, but they probably haven't pruned this particular plant at all, so it's up to this point. So it's really required very little maintenance, and I guarantee you there are very few weeds that are going to come up in this situation. So an excellent option. This drip irrigation with inline emitters, that's really the way to go here, and it's the most low maintenance irrigation option you have. So many different options here. Buffalo juniper. The biggest issue I see with junipers is that they're just planted far too often, almost always, in fact, in situations where they get too big. And I'm sure all of you have seen situations where they've swallowed sidewalks, even front doors of homes. So that's the main thing to consider when planting spreading junipers. Just make sure you give them enough room. Lavender here, typically I cut that back once in spring, does really well. Looks great in mass. It's sort of a semi-shrub that requires a little more maintenance than most shrubs, but is a good option in our climate with just one intervention a year. Native grasses, again, as I showed you before, excellent option. There are a variety of different mixes to use, but you really want to try to stick with a mix that includes mostly blue grama and buffalo, typically. Blue grama grass, if you've got that sandy soil, I mentioned that maybe isn't best for buffalo grass, then maybe blue grama is the best option for you. And blue grama is really it's the predominant native grass in our area. So it's very widespread and a very good plant for covering the ground by seeding. This is another example of it where it's mowed periodically. I mow my buffalo grass about 3 times a year. You could do the same with blue grama, although it's a little taller than buffalo grass, so it may require a little bit more mowing. But and mixing the two is actually a really good option. There are perennials, herbaceous plants that are great at covering the ground. I've seen people plant this Turkish speedwell up on top here as a ground cover. It's not as low maintenance as maybe a native grass mix or spreading shrubs, but if you want, you know, these flowers, it is a good option for folks as long as you plant it densely and kind of keep up with the maintenance. This germander below, that's actually probably one of the best perennials for covering the ground here and competing with weeds. That particular plant is very dense and it's very challenging for any weeds to come up through it. So it's an excellent option for competing with weeds and covering the ground as well. As I mentioned several times, this wood-based mulch and organic mulch, that's really a great option for buying you time. Even if you've planted a lot of plants, you still may have large areas that you don't know what to do with and you're struggling to control the weeds. So like in this situation, this customer had a large mature tree. They planted some evergreens and some flowers around, but on the side of their house they really didn't want to spend more money for more shrubs and things, and you know, they wanted some area where they could sit and hang out. And rather than put in gravel or a patio, they did something that was really, really affordable. Using the city's free mulch, they've covered the ground here, and they're competing really well with the weeds and meeting their needs, providing a place to sit and hang out in the shade and without having to do a lot of maintenance. So this is really one of your best options for covering the ground and competing with the weeds and keeping your maintenance to a minimum. As this says, you know, replenishing it every year or two, depending on the situation. If it's a really windy site, you probably need to do it every year. In this situation, you know, in a backyard with a fence around it, if you put it down at, you know, 4 inches thick, it's really probably every 2 years you'd have to replenish it. And so you have to plan for that, but you know, in the overall scheme of things, that's pretty easy maintenance in my book. So as I mentioned before, we have this website, waterwiseplants.org. It's an excellent way to kind of narrow down your choices, so you can filter by the types of plants, how much water you want them to use. Under features there, you can see low maintenance is an option. So you can choose those attributes, and then you can select your favorites, and you can actually create a list that you could print out and take with you to a garden center. I find that's a far better way of getting the right plants than just going to the nursery and buying the plants with the pretty flowers. All right, thanks everyone. Good luck.